Hello, everyone. I've already crossed over the 40,000 word deadline for my second book for Author vs. AI, which is called Cheaper by the Scoundrel. I'll post on my website tonight how high I can go in my word count. In the meantime, here's an excerpt from the book, as promised. This is from the start of the book in Chapter 2. It's just after the main character, Steno, found out that King Roberts is raising taxes for the mythic community to astronomical heights. She's heading to her local pub to wash away her sorrows. As soon as Steno walked through the doorway of the pretty pay show, a chorus of cheers went up calling out her name. She raised a hand to the table where her friends were perched to indicate she'd get to them eventually, but first made a beeline for the bar. It was located near the rear of the room, and there was a line too deep ordering drinks. Steno didn't bother to wait. She just pushed her way to the front. Most of the customers knew her, so as soon as they saw who it was giving them a shove, they knew better than to argue. She'd been brawling at this bar before most of them were born, or hatched, or created, and she had never been on the wrong end of a fist fight. Only the side that won, which turned out to never be the wrong one. There were a couple of barmaids who made the rounds of the tables for those too lazy or too inebriated to make it to the bar, but it was always better to go to the source. Kairos, the bar's owner and bartender. Less likely for him to water down the drinks if you were standing right in front of him, but he'd confided in her once that he had no hang-ups about doing so if the barmaids were involved. It wouldn't affect their tips, and he would save a pretty pay show or two. They'd had a good laugh over his naming of the bar. He could have equally called it the Idiotic Rube, or Those Who Love to Be Fleeced. But Steno agreed with him that the pretty pay show was the best of those choices. They had been friends almost since the year he had hatched, and she wouldn't judge him. She merely ordered her drinks directly from him at that point onwards. He seemed on fire today, each of his 9 heads listening to a different customer, and his hands whipping out drinks nearly as quickly. It was a pity he didn't have 9 hands as well, but he seemed to make do with just the 2. There weren't many hydras in the city, Steno knew, and there were none better or faster than Kairos. As soon as he saw her, he swung a head around to chat. "What's up, Buttercup?" he asked. Then he studied the parts of her that he could see through her mask. "You look like you need a drink." "I always need a drink," she replied in a sly tone of voice, and he laughed. "I suppose we all do." From his sunny attitude, she figured he hadn't heard the news about the increased taxes, but his next words belied that. "I have a feeling my clientele will shortly be dwindling when none of us can afford the price of bread anymore, let alone ale." At the last word, he plopped down a mug in front of her she hadn't even seen him pour. She grabbed it and toasted him. "You're the best," she said, before taking a device out of her pouch. It was a simple thing, basically a hollow reed. She always kept a few on her at all times. She stuck one end in her drink and the other under the edge of her mask and into her mouth. She'd learned the hard way over the years that taking off her mask to enjoy her booze didn't always leave the other customers happy, and Kairos wasn't partial to stone statues cluttering up his bar. "It's a racket," Steno said now, "this new tax." The long neck of Kairos's head whipped forward. "Who said anything about a tax? I didn't say anything," he announced loudly. A couple of creatures turned toward them at Kairos's tone, then glanced away again, bored. He lowered his voice. "Careful," he warned. He darted his eyes back and forth, and she nodded. You never knew who was listening. Even in this bar, in the heart of the mythic community, there could be eyes and ears for the crown. "Put it on my tab," she said instead, raising her glass again. Kairos nodded, and his head wandered off to a new customer. She made her way back to the tables at the front of the pub. There was the usual eclectic crew hanging out tonight, and many of them were regulars like her. "Hey, Peterson," she greeted one of her friends who was sitting the nearest to her. He was drinking a sludgy mixture that seemed to have chunks floating in it, all of the mixture an unappetizing pinkish gray. As he turned to look at her, his ear dropped into his drink. An unfortunate accident, and she discreetly pointed it out to him. "Oh, thanks." He fished the ear back out and pulled a sewing packet from his pocket that had needle and thread. "Give me a second." He began to stitch without looking, and pretty soon his ear was back in place, although a little lopsided. Pesky things. She'd never asked why a zombie needed to drink anything. but she supposed that Kyrus's signature cranial cocktail would be a hit with a certain crowd here, not just zombies. Certainly Peterson wasn't the only one to be drinking it. Although Steno would never ask where the bartender sourced his fresh brains, she'd known Peterson for several decades. He was a bit more decrepit these days, but she supposed there was only so much magic could do to hold together a rotting body, and the cocktails certainly didn't hurt to help preserve him. Pickling things was sort of what alcohol was for. As she watched, he took a swig of his drink, then followed it up by shoveling several fried, salty potato slices into his mouth from his bulging pouch, which must be filled to the brim with them. She sometimes got the munchies when she drank, but Peterson seemed to be doing it mechanically, almost as if he didn't notice he was doing it. Well, to each their own. Fortuna was seated on the floor, although her expression seemed to be unhappy with that fact. Her tail twitched restlessly beside her, and Steno was impressed that it never got stepped on in the crowded bar. Supposedly, it would only ever get stepped on once before the Wampus cat made sure that the person doing the stepping never stepped again. Seated, Fortuna's head came up above the table. In front of her was an empty bowl that looked like it had something alcoholic in it once upon a time. The cat's eyes were glassy, so Steno supposed it wasn't her first drink of the night. Last around the table was Wabin. Although around the table was more subjective than usual in a case like his, he was perched next to the table, maybe. Like Kairos the bartender, Wabin was probably grateful for the very tall ceilings that allowed him to sit up and stretch out all of his 20-foot length from the tip of his snout to the end of his tail. He was partially balanced on his tail and hind legs, crouched down like an angry troll. He looked almost like a crocodile if crocodiles had 6 legs and a frog-shaped head with horns. He was the first and last wowie that Steno had ever met. "We don't get along with each other," he had confessed one time to her. "Last time I saw me mum, she was throwing me and my siblings off a cliff." "How terrible," Steno had sympathized. Not so bad," he replied. "There was ocean below. Me brother Mickey was much more unlucky. He got the sharp end of the stick." "Fell on the beach instead," she guessed. "Nah." He eyeballed her like she was dense. "He got a stick shoved into his shoulder. A sharp one." "Oh, I see." Not really much to say after that. Although she did wonder how wowies ever made new ones if they hated each other that much. But that wasn't really something you would ask in polite company. Or impolite company either, especially not to something that had teeth the length of her fingers. If you like this, stay tuned for my next book project, which will be starting on Monday. As I mentioned before, this is book 1 in a 2-book series, so I'll be telling you all about book 2 starting tomorrow. Okay, guys, have a great weekend. Bye.